So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this seminar and speech at the Swedish Psychological Defense Agency. And we're having a Ukraine Day to highlight and expose the situation we're in Europe right now with the ongoing war in Ukraine and Russia's ongoing information war. And therefore, we're really proud to have this special seminar today. The war in Ukraine serves as a warning and actually also as a good example for what democratic and peace-loving nations must be prepared for. And that is why the Psychological Defense Agency has committed a day for Ukraine here in Almedalen. And it's also my honor to invite the historian and author, Professor Timothy Snyder, who is a world-leading expert specializing in the history of Central and Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, and the Holocaust. He's also a strong supporter for Ukraine, and I would say he is a hero to many of us. So please let me invite Timothy Snyder.
Thank you very much. Good morning. It's very nice to be with you in this beautiful place. I'm very appreciative that you have welcomed me to your island. I spent yesterday exploring it. And of course, when I think about our gathering here today, and I think about what makes it possible, I have in mind, the peacefulness of all of this, right? So we're in this extraordinary situation where we can simply do what we want to do. And that's where I want to begin, that it could be very different. We could be living in a very different world. Swedes, Americans, Europeans, all of us could be in a very different world right now. We could be at war in a much more profound and direct way. Swedish men and women could be fighting right now. Other Europeans could be fighting right now. And the reason that you're not is Ukraine. The reason that you're not fighting, the reason that we're not fighting is Ukraine. We're in a very special situation where we are in something that is very much like a world war, but only one country is doing the fighting. Only one country is doing the fighting. It might help to try to explain this if I use an analogy. So I'm going to begin with thinking about how the actual Second World War began. The Second World War began with Czechoslovakia, of course. The Second World War began in 1938 when Germany demanded that Czechoslovakia surrender. And Czechoslovakia was a democracy, an East European democracy, imperfect. It had national minorities, people spoke various languages, but nevertheless it was probably in most respects the best country in its region. The Czechs decided not to fight. Their allies let them go, sold them out, gave them away. And the result was the Second World War. So when Germany then invades Poland in 1939, it's not just Germany invading Poland. It's Germany with all of the Czechoslovak wealth, with tens of thousands of Slovak soldiers, invading from a very different geography from the south as well as from the west and the north, with the Czech arms industry, with Czech weapons technology, which at the time was the best in the world. Now, I mention all of that because that's not what happened in 2022. In 2022, we also had a flawed democracy in Eastern Europe, interesting place, some national minorities, people speak different languages, but probably in many ways the best country in its region, and of course I mean Ukraine. When Putin threatened Ukraine in 2022, he used essentially the same language that Hitler used with Czechoslovakia in 1938. He was a dictator, but he talked about how a democracy was somehow illegitimate. He was a fascist, but somehow he talked about how the Democrats were the ones who were the real dictators. He claimed that he needed to invade in order to protect national minorities or people speaking different languages. He said that the other states' borders were somehow not legitimate. And the he in all of my sentences could be either Hitler or Putin. It was essentially the same rationale which was used. The difference in 2022 was that Ukrainians resisted. That's the difference. And because Ukrainians resisted, that means that all of the rest of us get to do things like this. We get to put on our sundresses or our sandals or whatever it is and come to nice islands in the Baltic Sea and spend a week. There are other things that we could be doing right now, much grimmer, darker things. And the reason we're not doing them is the Ukrainians. Now, this could all still change. If we let the Ukrainians go, if we let the Ukrainians lose, and it is up to us, we could still find ourselves in that world of 1939. And it would be much more like 1939 in Europe in very specific ways. If Ukraine loses, and the rest of you, and Sweden would be close to the front line now, the rest of you have to fight Russia. What does that mean? Well, you're not fighting just Russia. Again, it's like 1938 to 1939. You'll be fighting Russia with a different geography, well, that includes much or all of Ukraine. You'll be fighting a Russia which includes Ukrainians fighting on the Russian side, hard though that is for Ukrainians to hear. You'll be fighting a Russia which has all of Ukraine's weapons technologies, some of which are extremely important in the world right now. You'll be fighting a Russia which has the confidence that you gain when you win a major war. So you won't be fighting the Russia that exists now. You'll be fighting a very different Russia, just like Poland had to fight a very different Germany in 1939. So what the Ukrainians are doing is they're holding all of that back for you. They're holding all of that back, and I don't think they get nearly enough credit. But now let me reflect a little bit more generally about what it means to hold off conflict in the 21st century. What does it mean to say that the Ukrainians are holding things back? Because, of course, it isn't really 1939, it's really 2024. So what are the Ukrainians holding off? Or to put it in a positive way, what are they preserving for the rest of us? One of the things that they're preserving, so again, this is in addition to preventing an actual war in Europe, which is already a big deal, I would like to say. This is all in addition to that. In addition to that, they are preserving international legal order, because the basis of our international legal order after 1945 or 1948 is the idea that countries don't take territory from other countries by force. That's number one. Number two, the Ukrainians are giving the European idea a chance. The fundament, the basis of the European idea is that there aren't empires anymore. And instead you have states, and the states choose to cooperate within their existing boundaries. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is an assertion of an imperial principle, of a very different principle of international order, in which might makes right, law doesn't really matter, and all of you Europeans are naive for believing anything else. So although Ukraine is not in the European Union yet, it's holding off the imperial alternative to the European idea. The third thing that Ukraine is holding off is the possibility of a war in the Far East. That is to say, Ukraine, by resisting Russia, is making it much less likely that China will intervene in Taiwan. And if you will remember, if you can think back to 2021, that was everyone's big concern about a world war in 2021. It's what the Americans have been thinking about nonstop for about 20 years. The possibility of world war was connected to the Pacific. Now, by holding back Russia, the Ukrainians are making that scenario for war much less likely, because they're teaching the Chinese how hard something like this might be. But now, imagine if Russia wins. If Russia wins, it no longer looks so difficult. And if Russia wins, suddenly Russia has all of the military technology that Ukraine has, some of which would be very relevant to a Chinese-Taiwan conflict. So that's number three. Number four, nuclear proliferation or nuclear war. So again, something we used to worry about quite a bit, and some of us still do. Ukraine is in the very unique situation that it is a country that gave up its nuclear weapons and then was invaded by a country with nuclear weapons. And the country with nuclear weapons is constantly blackmailing the rest of us and saying, we're going to use them today, tomorrow, next Wednesday, whatever it's going to be. And if Ukraine loses this war, what's the lesson? The lesson will be everybody has to have nuclear weapons, because it will turn out that nuclear weapons are the only way to stop a nuclear power from blackmailing you or invading you. So, and this is not just a speculation on my part, it's not just a logic. This is already happening. These plans are already underway. Middle-sized powers, some of which are just across the Baltic Sea from you, are already considering building nuclear weapons. Countries that are in Asia are already considering building nuclear weapons. So if Ukraine can't win a conventional war, then we can expect nuclear proliferation, which makes a nuclear war much more likely. That's number 4. Number 5, oligarchy. So there is a problem in the world which I refer to as billionaire syndrome. The English abbreviation is BS. And the problem consists in when you have $10 billion or more, you start to become extremely stupid. And the more after 10 billion, the higher you get, the stupider you become. And the problem with this specific form of stupidity is that it attracts other people, because this stupidity is backed by a lot of money, right? And the stupidity takes the particular form of having wild ideas, which tend to take the future away from the rest of us, right? So the idea that we're going to live forever is a stupid billionaire idea, which takes the future away from the rest of us. The idea that we're going to all go to Mars, or some of us, is a stupid billionaire idea, which takes the future away from the rest of us. The idea that Ukraine doesn't exist is a stupid billionaire idea, which takes the future away from the rest of us, right? Putin's crazy notions about Ukrainian history are one way that the oligarchs are taking the future away from the rest of us. And that's a way, and that's one more reason that this war has to end the right way. Very much connected to this, although again it might seem abstract, is climate. Putin isn't just an oligarch, he's a hydrocarbon oligarch. And there are hydrocarbon oligarchs in other places, in Saudi Arabia, in the United States. But what they have in common is that they are working towards a future in which oil and natural gas will continue to be the main sources of energy. Hydrocarbons brought Putin to the position he's in, with some German help. And hydrocarbons fund this war. And this war in Ukraine is a kind of taste of what the hydrocarbon oligarchs, it is the future the hydrocarbon oligarchs basically have in mind for the rest of us. Struggles over resources, propaganda, distraction. So climate is the final thing. And that leads me to the last thing that the Ukrainians are defending. It's very much connected to the mission of this agency. And I'm going to say it in a very old-fashioned way, which is truth. Truth, knowledge, the possibility that we can understand the world. The Ukrainians are essentially saying, hey, we're a real country, people live in this country, we want to survive. The Russians are saying, you're Nazis, you're Jews, you're gay Nazi Jews. The West, you're also gay Nazi Jews, or whatever, right? This war, the way that the Russians can win this war is by scrambling everybody's mind. That's the way. That is, in fact, the one way. And if you live in the United States, which is a much more defenseless culture, I think, than this one to Russian propaganda, you're reminded of this every day. Because the sheer wildness of the things that people permit themselves to say, which they only can have from Russian propaganda, is really startling. I mean, I spend time testifying in the United States Congress to people, elected officials who do nothing but repeat things which they could only have had from Russian propaganda. So knowledge, right? And without knowledge, without some sense of reality, we're not going to get far into the next century. So the point that I've made is that Ukraine is very central to our having a 21st century. The next point I want to make is a historical one, which is that we shouldn't be surprised by this. Ukraine has been a bit of a dark spot for many of us, right? From the point of view of Sweden or Europe or North America, Ukraine doesn't seem like much. Maybe it's a borderland of somebody else's empire. What is it really? But often history directs our attention away from the things that are the most central. And Ukraine is an excellent example of that. I'm just going to give you now 3 minutes to persuade you that Ukraine is actually the absolute center of world history. All right. The Second World War was about Ukraine. The Second World War was a German colonial war to control Ukrainian food resources. That's what it was all about. That was Hitler's main purpose. And incidentally, the reason he was so concerned with Ukraine was that he knew that Stalin had been able to control Ukraine's food resources, and he wanted to do exactly the same thing. Ukraine was entirely central to the whole Soviet project. Go back 1,000 years to the Viking Age. What was the Viking Age all about? Well, if you go to the museum, more or less next door, you can see hordes and hordes and hordes of wealth, which the nice people of Gotland and eastern Sweden were able to assemble because of their extraordinarily successful commercial and colonial venture down through what's now northern Russia, through Belarus, and into Ukraine, into a city called Kiev, which they essentially founded, creating a state called Rus. And for about 500 years, people from here, central Swedes, but also Danes, Norwegians, Icelanders, for about 500 years, people from here had a very long adventure in that part of the world, which created the Kievan state, but I would submit it also to a large extent, and this is a longer story, created you. Your sagas, your myths, your whole backstory has a huge amount to do with Balts, Finns, Slavs, Khazars, the people that you encountered during those 500 years. Okay, go back another 1,000 years before that. How does the Roman Empire come to an end? The Roman Empire comes to an end because Goths, however you say Goths, you've got like 17 ways to say Goths. It's extremely confusing. You've got your Geats and your Gauts and your Goths, and like, I'm going to figure this out at some point. But the Goths who inhabit Ukraine cross the Danube in 376 AD, and that leads to the destruction of the Western Roman Empire. I submit an important event. Go back another 1,000 years to the beginning of classical history, the beginning of classical Greece. How does that begin? It begins because Greeks from Attica, from around Athens and other places, other cities in that part of Greece, colonized the northern Black Sea. They colonized the northern Black Sea at exactly the same moment that people who are called the Scythians are settling. And towns along the northern Black Sea, what we now call Crimea, what we now call Kerch, those places, what we now call Mykolaiv or Odessa, that part of the world, those towns then become the economic and to a large extent also the cultural basis of classical Greece, of 4th century Greece, the Greece that brings us the philosophy, the mathematics, all these nice things, is fed by, literally fed by, that's where the food comes from, but also intellectually and culturally supported by lands that we now call Ukraine. Okay, go back another 1,000 years before that, and we have in Ukraine the very first people, they were called the Yamna, the very first people who figured out that you could ride horses. Seems like a small thing, but humans, you were really happy about the billionaire syndrome thing, so I'm going to let you in on another secret. Humans in general are not super smart. So we've spent tens and tens of thousands of years with horses, and all we did was eat them until someone in Ukraine figured out you could ride them. And that was a huge technological leap because it allowed for pastoral agriculture, and it also created military advantage over your opponents. So people in what is now Ukraine, called the Yamna, who spoke a Proto-Indo-European language, because of their advantage in agriculture and the military, brought their language, versions of it, all across Europe and deep into Asia, which means that everybody who speaks any language, from Urdu, Hindi, to whatever, to English, half the population of the world owes a very profound part of their cultural history to the lands that are now Ukraine. This language that we're speaking, or I'm speaking, and the language that you speak to each other, Swedish, these are all Ukrainian, these are all Indo-European languages. Hindi, right? Sanskrit, classical Greek. All of this stuff is Indo-European, and it all comes from the lands that are Ukraine. Okay, back another 1,000 years. The largest cities in the world, the first cities in the world, were built in what's now south-central Ukraine. The first human settlements that had more than about 10,000 people were created by the Tripilia culture in what's now south-central Ukraine, about halfway between Kiev and Odessa. So why am I mentioning all this? Why do this deep history? Well, for one thing, I just want to stress that there's an idea of freedom that one can get when one recognizes that all kinds of different things have come from a place. So if you think Ukraine, oh, it's somebody's borderland, or let's obsess about what language people are speaking right now, or whatever, then you're caught up in a 20th century story. There are much larger and more interesting stories. Related to that, if we think about Ukraine in all of these ways, we realize, aha, our own paradigms, whether they're of Swedish history or European history or Western civilization, these are very limited. These are very constraining. And in fact, there are all kinds of ways that we are connected to this part of the world. And I would venture to say that if you're Swedish in particular, this part of the world is extremely essential to who you are. And that although the war is a horrible moment to do so, it may also be an opportunity to figure out how your history is more interesting and broader and more global than you perhaps have considered it to be. A third reason, and this is sort of the negative one, is that the Russian story of why they're fighting this war, it obviously makes no sense, right? The idea that there were Russians 1,000 years ago, it doesn't make any sense. It's wrong, completely wrong. But more interestingly, we have this much bigger, broader, fascinating narrative. And then the final point, and this is going to be a very hardcore military point, when one looks at these last 5,000 years, it reminds us of some very basic facts about how wars are lost and won, and about how people end up on territory or not. First of all, technology. The horse is the reason why people were able to sweep across Ukraine. Viking ships are the reason why people were able to go down the Dnipro. And the relevant technology today is, of course, the drone. The second is the centrality of the rivers. The Greeks, the Vikings, everybody with any thought tried to control the mouth of the Danube, the Dnipro, and the Don. And specifically on the mouth of the Don, the Kerch Bridge, from the Greeks to the Vikings, everyone understood if you wanted to have a viable state in this part of the world, you had to control the particular part of the connection between the Black Sea and the Azov Sea, the Kerch Bridge. So I don't want to say that like you need 5,000 years to tell you that the Kerch Bridge has to come down. I wish we didn't need 5,000 years to tell us that, but if we haven't figured it out, the Kerch Bridge has to come down. Thank you very much for listening to this. My point has been that Ukraine is holding us back from a world of conflict, and that this shouldn't be surprising because this has been a part of the world which is actually much more central to how things have gone for a very, very long time. Thank you very much.
And thank you. I know that you're about to run to the plane, but maybe we have time for just one or two questions.
Of course.
I will actually take the opportunity to ask the first question, and then there will only be time for one other. And that is, listening to this history that you've been telling us, which is also Ukrainian-centric. The Russians, as you mentioned with their imperialistic view, how much has history played in Putin's decision-making, which for us didn't make sense, in invading Ukraine?
I think I mean, as a historian, it hurts me to call it history. I prefer to think of it as myth or propaganda. But certainly, his view of the past is incredibly important. His view of the past is something like 1,000 years ago, a Russia was called into existence by God. And ever since, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus have been one thing, and nothing else matters. So all the other things that might be facts, those are inessential, those are exotic, those are interventions, those are artificial, right? From Putin's point of view, what happened was there were Russians in Novgorod, and they invited in some Varangians, and that proves that Russians existed. Now, like, the facts of that story is wrong. Novgorod didn't exist at the time. There were no Slavs in that part of the world at the time. The people who lived there were Finns. The people who created the town in question, which is Ladoga or Algelga, were Swedes, right? Like, the facts are 100% wrong. But the facts are not so important. It's the way you think about the past that's important. If you think about the past and you say, aha, the past is full of surprises, discoveries, connections, then you're doing one thing. If you look at the past and you say, I'm a tyrant, and I'm going to say what's true, and everything else is detail, and I'm going to fight a war to prove what's true, right? That's not history anymore. So it's not just that he's wrong about the facts. He's wrong about all the facts. But it's also that he's wrong about how things work, right? But yeah, I mean, the past means a lot to them, and it's really, like, Russia's a key example for the rest of the world, including for the United States. How if you turn the past into a drama where the facts don't matter, no one else is present, and you're always innocent, no matter what you do, you're going to end up hurting other people, and you're going to end up fighting wars.
Okay, we have one more question. If anyone in the audience has a question, make it precise, not a speech. No one dares? Then I will.
No.
Good.
You were mentioning it, but it struck me a while ago that Putin is not propaganda for him. He actually believes this, which make it worse. Is that your opinion as well?
Yeah, that's my opinion. So I have a view, which again touches on the work that this agency does. The Russians are good at propaganda because they take this view that nothing is true, right? So we have various truth commitments, like I believe I'm on an island, and I believe that most of you are Swedish, and I believe that you're wearing a purple blouse and you're laughing at my jokes. Like whereas the Russians start from the idea that nothing is factually true and nothing is ethically true. And that gives them a big advantage because they live in that world, and so they're able to push that world out into us. And all the things which slow us down, we are slowed down because we are stuck in reality. We're stuck in moral reality. We're stuck in factual reality. And so in propaganda, they're always a step ahead of us, right? So they say things which are contradictory, or they say things which are hugely untrue, and we are stuck. We're delayed. What are we supposed to think about this? But the people who claim to believe in nothing, at the end of the day, always believe in something incredibly stupid. Like the end point of perfect cynicism is perfect naivete. So Putin is not alone in this. There are quite a few very intelligent, sophisticated Russians who think that they are totally immune to everything. Like they're beyond it all. But they hold unbelievably stupid ideas about Russian history, right? So I think Putin really believes that Novgorod existed when it didn't exist. I think he really believes that there were Slavs there when there weren't. I think he really believes that those people were Russians in some meaningful sense, even though the notion of a Russian person doesn't come on the scene till 1,000 years later. I think he really believes that they got together and they said, hey, Vikings, even though you just ravaged our town, we'd like you to come and rule us, even though you're just selling us into slavery so you can accumulate a bunch of silver coins in Gotland, we still want you to... That didn't go over well. Of course it's true. Of course it's true. That's history, people. History isn't what you want to hear. even though you just enslaved us and raided us and so on, we want you to come govern us. I think Putin actually believes that. I think he actually believes that this Viking called Valdemar, who had 600 concubines, and he did terrible things, which I'm not even going to say in front of this recording apparatus. I think he actually believes that this fellow Valdemar was called Vladimir and was a saint and magically communed with God and created nations that exist forever. I think he honestly does believe that. And it has to do with this kind of like this human thing where the people who claim to believe in nothing, they end up believing in perfect idiocy, right? So like there's a price you pay for being like the black clad, cynic. And the price is you end up believing in stuff which is ridiculous, right? But the ridiculous things you believe in can be harmful to everyone else, as we see. So thanks for that question.
And thereby, thank God for being stuck in reality. And
yeah.
And thank you so much, Timothy Snyder. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thanks.